Alright, so this one comes from at 2005 at 11:41 a.m. It is from Nova. Stop, baby. It is from Glenn to, and so she sent. I'm gonna have to do things slightly different, mostly just because I got multiple things from the YouTube that were telling me that I was like trying to dox somebody essentially, which is fairly interesting. They ended up putting all of the other videos up, but I had like 3 of them that they were like, oh yeah, you're sharing other people's stuff, and I was like, no, it's from a website, and it's literally, you can go on the .gov site and read it for yourself, but alright. So we're gonna do me reading it. I'm so sorry. At least for a couple of days. I don't know if it's because I'm new or like what. But yeah. So okay. Glenn wrote working title, an author, a source. She said, and it's this little synopsis thing from like a book or something. I'm not really sure, but. Working title, an author, a source. Although I started my search for the elusive book I heard in that radio ad in Houston in 1983, it wasn't until about 1993 that I came across a title that seemed to work. The Immaculate Deception was the title. It appeared on a book list put out by a small publisher in Nevada that subsequently moved to Montana. The Immaculate Deception, the Bush crime family exposed by Brigadier General Russell S. Bowen. Retired, Carson City, Nevada, American West, 1991. Was written largely in 1989 in the edition that was being printed in 1993, but it seems clear to me from the book's jacket description, from a few passages in the book, and from the introduction by its author, who is formerly an agent of the CIA, that the book was originally started and written to some extent by around 1979. That seems highly significant in light of the 1980 date. Bowen says he first got interested in writing the Immaculate Deception around 1977 after the death of Chilean ambassador Letelier, possibly at CIA hands. This was shortly before the retirement from CIA of another renegade agent, Philip Agee, who had also published some whistleblower books about the CIA. Agee had even made the conservative Carter administration angry with his threats to destroy the agency via publishing sensitive material. It seems clear to me, based on the coincidence of the dates of the two men's attempts to write about CIA, that each fed the other on some level. Agee had been sued by the Carter administration, however, the suit was still ongoing at the time of Carter's defeat by Reagan. Carter's suit on behalf of the CIA was carried on under the Reagan-Bush administration by the new Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, in a case that appeared before the Supreme Court as Haig v. Agee. Some interesting things happened to Alexander Haig after his, I don't know what that word is, in control here, something, heresy? I have no idea. Statement. He served the Reagan administration as Secretary of State for about a year. At the time, he was fired. He writes in his memoir, caveat, he was listening to his radio and heard he'd resigned. It was the first he'd heard of it. Haig 31017. Previously, Haig had told the president that if certain things couldn't be changed, he'd have to resign. A few days later, Reagan had handed Haig a sealed envelope with a note which... with profound regret that I accept your letter of resignation. It was a letter he hadn't yet submitted to the president. However, and was the last in a series of what can only be described as some word. Okay, so I've talked on a couple of other videos about how they have like this weird typo thing going on, and they use like different font things. So it makes it a little interesting to read. Haig was drawing up his letter of resignation, but hadn't told the president he was doing so. Had told the president he was doing so, but he hadn't yet presented it to him. When Reagan appeared at a press conference and announced that Haig had resigned, Haig said he'd heard of his resignation on the radio. I've wondered, in light of subsequent information I've gathered about possible activities in which Haig was involved, if this specific incident occurred in precisely the way Haig originally described it. I've wondered whether he was speaking in that something that he used so often with which close associates are familiar. Was Haig saying in effect that he had heard the same radio ad as I had? Couldn't this be what he meant by saying he had heard this on the radio? Was he saying that in retrospect he should have known that he was fired by Reagan-Bush, in the sense that he, Haig, was unacceptable as an employee of such an administration since he had fought for the Allies in World War II? In dealing with Aggie, Haig may have been forced to deal with the problems that were presented by Aggie's fellow agent Bowen. General Bowen seems to have initially wanted to retire from the CIA in 1979. However, for some reason, he then decided he didn't want to retire from the CIA after all. In 1981, shortly after Reagan-Bush took office, Bowen seems either to have re-enlisted in the CIA or to have stayed in it. Though it seems odd to an outsider, this is quite common for a would-be former CIA agent. It is, in fact, almost impossible to merely retire from the CIA. Bowen was eventually to finally retire from the CIA in 1989, 10 years later. From what I can determine, this is when he published edition 2 of The Immaculate Deception. Bowen was eventually to retire from the CIA in 1989, 10 years later, when he published edition 2 of The Immaculate Deception. The conclusion that the 1989 book was edition 2 is drawn from several forms of information I've obtained and seems of some variation, the most likely of several scenarios that explains the book ad. That takes care of the title of the book in question and the possible author or authors, or how Bowen may have somehow been aware of the title and of some of the research that went into the production of that book. But that still leaves open the question of who the source of the ad for the book was. What mysterious advertising agency would run an ad for a book, then withdraw it before it ever appeared in print before the general public? In many ways, the search for the source of that book ad was a mystery in itself. Over the past few years, I've learned of the activities of Robert Maxwell, British publisher, British Israeli secret agent, and tycoon. I believe, based on years of research now, that Maxwell was the source of that mysterious 1980 election year ad. I think his involvement was a part of the scenario that brought about the October surprise that defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. Bauer, Tom Maxwell, The Outsider, New York, 1992, Viking, 13, 15, 2748 to 83, 343 to 6, 442 to 3, 460 to 65, 470 to 507. Interesting data on Maxwell's body and the state in which it was found. Also interesting correlation of dates of some of Maxwell's buyouts and activities and the ongoing political climates at the time. Maxwell, The Final Verdict, New York, 1996. 1 through 8, 301 to 13. These are going to be pages. Anyway, more interesting data on Maxwell's death and his many times to the world intelligence communities, more interesting dates and events that correlate well with the political pressures Bush would have been under during various election years. In the case of in the case of both of these books, Bauer comes across as perhaps a bit too tough on Maxwell. He goes into too much gory detail in describing the 91 autopsy, isn't at all sensitive in his treatment of the widow Betty and daughter Ghislaine during the 1991 funeral arrangements, virtually accuses his sons of being incompetents and outsider, then backtracks on this charge in order to further insult Maxwell by implying he was unfair to his sons in Final Verdict. Maxwell, his attorneys, and sons all attempted to keep Bauer's books from publication. They were only successful in Britain itself, which is somewhat different libel laws. This in itself, however, may reveal that Maxwell had experienced some degree of pre-publication harassment himself and was attempting to apply the same methods to his own critics. 1987, going into the 1988 presidential election, Maxwell is attempting to buy out the Daily News. That publication folded, but not immediately. There was still some potential for an expose to run there. By 88, he was trying unsuccessfully to buy into American publishers, HBJ and the New York Post. HBJ. I don't know which publisher that is. Nicholas Davies, The Unknown Maxwell, London, Sedgwick and Jackson, Limited 92, Pan 93. Yet another negative biography of Robert Maxwell does have interesting data. Read the circumstances of his death, cited by Russell Davies. 334. However, what was unusual about Maxwell's last flight to the Lady Ghislaine was that he went alone. No secretary, no valet, no butler, no one. He had never done that before. Bauer does note that Maxwell cheered up when he got news that a young woman had come aboard after a stop at one of the Canary Islands. 3:36. Maxwell told Rankin to sail to the Canaries and arrived in the morning of November 4th. He spoke to Burrington and apologized for disrupting his lunch. He phoned Dr. Passard in Paris. Passard recalled, "We talked of plans for the immediate future, chiefly Maxwell's excitement at being nominated by the Scientific Institute and France to receive the Legion d'Honneur? I don't know. France's highest award, and he was to be made Man of the Year by the Jewish Scientific and Cultural Institute at the Plaza Hotel, New York, later in November. There was satisfaction in his voice. A man that contemplates suicide does not think that way. 3:38. On the morning Maxwell died, the main sliding doors were found. And then Epstein's reply was, "Who wrote this?" So, to be fair, you don't just one of the things that they say in there is you don't really retire from the CIA. That is true. You do not retire from the company. You get outmoded, you die, but you will kind of always be kept on call, even if it's just as a consultant. That's just general practice. They don't really let you go because that's whenever you write books, and then there's a bigger problem. So, like I said, I'm going to start doing these emails one by one, mostly just because 15 minutes is kind of a long time per video. So for the longer emails, yeah, definitely, but I'll be making shorts for the shorter emails. Yeah, there's a lot of filler, and I would like to keep the good ones, not the good ones, the intriguing ones. None of this is cut. All of this is absolutely awful. But yeah, the intriguing ones, the ones that actually should be paid a bit more attention to, those will be the ones that I keep longer. So